Literary periods of British literature. Following are the periods of British literature. Old English period or Anglo-Saxon period from 450 to 1066. Middle English period from 1066 to 1500. The Renaissance from 1500 to 1660. Elizabethan Age from 1558 to 1603. Jacobean Age 1603 to 1625. Caroline Age 1625 to 1649. Commonwealth period or Puritan interregnum from 1649 to 1660. The Neoclassical period from 1660 to 1785. The Restoration from 1660 to 1700. The Augustan Age or Age of Pope from 1700 to 1745. The Age of Sensibility or Age of Johnson from 1745 to 1785. The Romantic period from 1785 to 1830. The Victorian period from 1832 to 1901. The Pre-Raphaelites 1848 to 1860. Aestheticism and Decadence from 1880 to 1901. The Edwardian period from 1901 to 1914. The Georgian period from 1910 to 1936. The Modern period from 1914 to 1945. Now the Postmodern period from 1945 till present. Old English period or Anglo-Saxon period from 450 AD to 1066 AD. The Old English period or the Anglo-Saxon period refers to the literature produced from the invasion of Celtic England by Germanic tribes in the first half of the 5th century to the conquest of England in 1066 by William the Conqueror. During the Old English period, written literature began to develop from old oral tradition, and in the 8th century poetry written in the vernacular Anglo-Saxon, also known as Old English, appeared. One of the most well-known 8th century Old English pieces of literature is Beowulf, a great Germanic epic poem. Two poets of the Old English period who wrote on biblical and religious themes were Caedmon and Cinewulf. Middle English period from 1066 to 1500. The Middle English period consists of the literature produced in the 4.5 centuries between the Norman conquest of 1066 and about 1500, when the standard literary language derived from the dialect of the London area became recognizable as modern English. Prior to the second half of the 14th century, vernacular literature consisted primarily of religious writings. The second half of the 14th century produced the first great age of secular literature. The most widely known of these writings are Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, the anonymous Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. The Renaissance from 1500 to 1660. While the English Renaissance began with the ascent of the House of Tudor to the English throne in 1485, the English literary Renaissance began with English humanists such as Sir Thomas More and Sir Thomas Wyatt. In addition, the English literary Renaissance consists of 4 subsets: the Elizabethan Age, the Jacobean Age, the Caroline Age, and the Commonwealth period or the Puritan interregnum. Elizabethan Age 1558 to 1603. The Elizabethan Age of English literature coincides with the reign of Elizabeth I from 1558 to 1603. During this time, medieval tradition was blended with Renaissance optimism. Lyric poetry, prose, and drama were the major styles of literature that flowered during the Elizabethan Age. Some important writers of the Elizabethan age include William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Ben Jonson. Jacobean Age from 1603 to 1625. The Jacobean Age of English literature coincides with the reign of James I from 1603 to 1625. During this time, the literature became sophisticated, somber, and conscious of social abuse and rivalry. The Jacobean Age produced rich prose and drama as well as the King James translation of the Bible. Shakespeare and Johnson wrote during the Jacobean Age as well as John Donne, Francis Bacon, and Thomas Middleton. Caroline Age from 1625 to 1649. The Caroline Age of English literature coincides with the reign of Charles I from 1625 to 1649. The writers of this age wrote with refinement and elegance. This era produced a circle of poets known as the Cavalier poets, and the dramatists of this age were the last to write in the Elizabethan tradition. Commonwealth period or Puritan interregnum from 1649 to 1660. The Commonwealth period, also known as the Puritan interregnum of English literature, includes the literature produced during the time of Puritan leader Oliver Cromwell. This period produced the political writings of John Milton, Thomas Hobbes, political treatises, Leviathan, and the prose of Andrew Marvell. In September of 1642, the Puritans closed the theatres on moral and religious grounds. For the next 18 years, the theatres remained closed, accounting for the lack of drama produced during this time period. The Neoclassical period from 1660 to 1785. The Neoclassical period of English literature from 1660 to 1785 was much influenced by contemporary French literature, which was in the midst of its greatest age. The literature of this time is known for its use of philosophy, reason, skepticism, wit, and refinement. The Neoclassical period also marks the first great age of English literary criticism. Much like the English literary Renaissance, the Neoclassical period can be divided into three subsets: the Restoration Age, the Augustan Age, and the Age of Sensibility. The Restoration period from 1660 to 1700. The Restoration period is marked by the restoration of the monarchy and the triumph of reason and tolerance over religious and political passion. The Restoration produced an abundance of prose and poetry and a distinctive comedy of manners known as Restoration comedy. It was during the Restoration that John Milton published Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. Other major writers of the era include John Dryden, John Wilmot, 2nd Earl of Rochester, and John Locke. The Augustan Age or Age of Pope from 1700 to 1745. The English Augustan Age derives its name from the brilliant literary period of Virgil and Ovid under the Roman Emperor Augustus, 27 BC to AD 14. In English literature, the Augustan Age refers to literature with the predominant characteristics of refinement, clarity, elegance, and balance of judgment. Well-known writers of the Augustan Age include Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, and Daniel Defoe. A significant contribution of this time period included the release of the first English novels of Defoe and the novel of character Pamela by Samuel Richardson in 1740. The Age of Sensibility or Age of Johnson from 1745 to 1785. During the Age of Sensibility, literature reflected the worldview of enlightenment and began to emphasize instinct and feeling rather than judgment and restraint. A growing sympathy for the Middle Ages during the Age of Sensibility sparked an interest in medieval ballads and folk literature. Another name for this period is the Age of Johnson because the dominant authors of this period were Samuel Johnson and his literature and intellectual circle. This period also produced some of the greatest early novels of the English literature, including Richardson's Clarissa 1745 and Henry Fielding's Tom Jones 1749. The Romantic period from 1785 to 1830. The Romantic period of English literature began in the late 18th century and lasted until around 1832. In general, Romantic literature can be characterized by its personal nature, its strong use of feelings, its abundant use of symbolism, and its exploration of nature and the supernatural matters. In addition, the writings of the Romantic writers were considered innovative based on their belief that literature should be spontaneous, imaginative, personal, and free. The Romantic period produced a wealth of authors, including Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, Jane Austen, and Lord Byron. It was during the Romantic period that Gothic literature emerged. Traits of Gothic literature are dark and gloomy settings, and characters and situations that are fantastic, grotesque, wild, savage, mysterious, and often melodramatic. Two of the most famous Gothic novelists are Anne Radcliffe and Mary Shelley. The Victorian period from 1832 to 1901. The Victorian period began with the accession of Queen Victoria to the throne in 1837 and lasted until her death in 1901. Because the Victorian period spans over 6 decades, the year 1870 is often divided into early Victorian and late Victorian. Some contemporary issues that the Victorian writers dealt with include social, economic, religious, intellectual issues and problems surrounding the Industrial Revolution, growing class tensions, the early feminist movement, pressures towards political and social reform, and the impact of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution on philosophy and religion. Some of the most recognized authors of the Victorian era include Alfred Lord Tennyson, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her husband Robert, Matthew Arnold, Charles Dickens, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy. Within the Victorian period, two other literary movements gained prominence: the Pre-Raphaelites from 1848 to 1860, the movement of aestheticism and decadence from 1880 to 1900. The Pre-Raphaelites movement from 1848 to 1860. In 1848, a group of English artists, including Dante Gabriel Rossetti, formed the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. It was the aim of this group to return painting to a style of truthfulness, simplicity, and religious devotion that had reigned prior to Raphael and the High Italian Renaissance. Rossetti and his literary circle, which included his sister Christina, incorporated these ideals into their literature, and the result was that of the literary Pre-Raphaelites. The aestheticism and decadence movement from 1880 to 1901. The aestheticism and decadence movement of English literature grew out of the French movement of the same name. The authors of this movement encouraged experimentation and held the view that art totally opposes natural norms of morality. This style of literature opposed the dominance of scientific thinking and defied the hostility of society to any art that was not useful or did not teach moral values. It was from the movement of aestheticism and decadence that the phrase art for art's sake emerged. A well-known author of the English aestheticism and decadence movement is Oscar Wilde. The Edwardian period from 1901 to 1914. The Edwardian period is named after King Edward VII and spans the time from Queen Victoria's death in 1901 to the beginning of World War I from 1914. During this time, the British Empire was flourishing rapidly and their lives were full of materialistic luxury. However, 4/5 of the English population lived in squalor. The writings of the Edwardian period reflect and comment on these social conditions. For example, writers such as George Bernard Shaw and H. G. Wells attacked social injustice and the selfishness of the upper classes. Other writers of the time include William Butler Yeats, Joseph Conrad, Rudyard Kipling, Henry James, and E. M. Forster. The Georgian period from 1910 to 1936. The Georgian period refers to the period of the reign of George V from 1910 to 36. Many writers of the Edwardian period continued to write during this period. This era also produced a group of poets known as the Georgian poets. About these writers, who are now regarded as minor poets, were once published in 4 anthologies titled Georgian Poetry, published by Edward Marsh between 1912 and 1922. Georgian poetry tends to focus on rural subject matters and is traditional in technique and form. The modern period from 1914 to 1945. The modern period applies to British literature written since the beginning of World War I in 1914. The authors of the modern period have experimented with subject matter, form, style, and have produced achievements in all literary genres. Poets of the period include Yeats, T.S. Eliot, Dylan Thomas, and Seamus Heaney. Novelists include James Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, and Virginia Woolf. Dramatists include Noel Coward and Samuel Beckett. Postmodern period from 1945 till present. Following World War II, from 1939 to 1945, the postmodern period of British literature developed. Postmodernism blends literary genres and styles and attempts to break free of modernist forms. While the British literary scene at the turn of the new millennium is crowded and varied, the authors still fall into the categories of modernism and postmodernism. However, with the passage of time, the modern era may be recognized and expanded.